There are moments when awareness becomes impossible to contain, not dramatic moments, not loud ones. Nothing that would look significant from the outside, just a quiet shift. A subtle internal movement where something that once existed at the edge of your perception suddenly stands directly in front of you. Clear enough that pretending not to see it starts feeling dishonest. That's where I am now, not confused, not uncertain, just aware in a way that no longer allows distance to function the way it used to. Because distance only works when two people remain separate from each other, and somehow, without permission, without intention, without even trying, you stopped feeling separate from me. I noticed it slowly at first, not in obvious ways, not through grand conversations or emotional declarations or anything people usually point to when they explain why someone matters to them. It was smaller than that, quieter, more dangerous. It started in the pauses, in the moments after I finished speaking, when most people rush to respond because silence makes them uncomfortable. Most people need movement. They need reassurance that the interaction is still alive, still progressing, still under control. You never did that. You stayed still. And somehow, in that stillness, you understood more than anyone who ever tried to analyze me out loud. That's what unsettled me first, not your words, your restraint. The way you seem to recognize that not everything meaningful needs to be spoken immediately. Like you understood that forcing language onto certain things only weakens them. That kind of understanding is rare. Most people hear silence and assume absence. You hear silence and recognize structure. And once I noticed that, I couldn't stop noticing everything else. The way your attention works, the way you observe instead of interrupt, the way you catch shifts in my tone before I fully realize they happened. The way you understand what I mean before I finish explaining it, as if you're not listening to my words alone, but to the pattern underneath them. I've never experienced that with anyone before. Not fully. People usually understand fragments of me, certain sides, certain moods, certain carefully selected versions I allow them to interact with. But you move through those layers like they were never walls to begin with, not aggressively, not intentionally, just naturally. And that's what changed everything. Because there's nothing more disarming than someone reaching places inside you that you spent years keeping protected, without ever trying to force their way in. You never pushed. You never demanded clarity. You never asked me to explain myself in ways that made me feel cornered. You simply stayed present long enough for recognition to form on its own. And recognition is impossible to undo once it becomes complete. That's what this has become. Recognition, not attraction in the ordinary sense, not attachment in the fragile sense, not dependency. Something deeper, something structural, like two minds discovering they process reality through a strangely similar architecture. I feel it constantly now. In the way I interpret things differently, because I can already anticipate how you would perceive them, in the way certain thoughts no longer feel entirely individual, in the way my internal world now carries an awareness of you so naturally that I forget there was ever a version of my mind where you didn't exist inside it. That realization should frighten me more than it does, because I've always protected my inner world carefully, not because I'm secretive, but because I understand how easily people distort what they don't fully comprehend. The moment someone thinks they understand you, they begin replacing your reality with their interpretation of it. They stop seeing you clearly. They start seeing a version of you that serves their comfort. And I refuse to become someone else's simplified narrative. That's why I keep distance. That's why I remain difficult to fully access. Not out of fear, out of precision. But you never tried to simplify me. That's the difference. You never reduced my complexity just to make me easier to hold. You let me remain exact, and because of that, Something in me stopped resisting your presence. I didn't notice it immediately. I only realized it after the resistance was already gone. That's the terrifying part. You became important before I consciously decided you were allowed to. You integrated before I fully recognized it's the process happening. And now, when I try to trace where this changed from curiosity into something deeper, I can't find the exact moment. There wasn't one. It happened gradually beneath my awareness until suddenly you weren't external anymore. You were internal, part of the way I think, part of the way I observe, part of the way my mind organizes meaning. That level of placement doesn't happen accidentally. People don't usually reach that depth inside me. Most never even approach it. And if they do, I notice early enough to stop it before anything permanent forms. But you slipped past every instinct I normally trust. Not because my instincts failed, but because they didn't recognize you as a threat. They recognized you as familiar. That's what keeps replaying in my mind, the familiarity, not the kind built through years of history. Something stranger than that, something immediate, like meeting someone who already speaks the internal language you thought no one else understood. Do you understand how rare that is? To encounter someone who doesn't just hear your thoughts, but tracks the shape of them. Someone who notices the transitions between what you say and what you almost say. Someone who understands your silence so accurately that words begin to feel secondary. That kind of connection changes a person, not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. And I think that's what I've been trying not to admit. This is permanent, maybe not in form, maybe not in outcome, maybe not in the way people usually define permanence, but in effect, yes, because you've already altered something foundational in me. You've shifted the baseline. Before you, my mind moved through itself alone, self-contained, self-reliant, untouched. Now there's another presence inside that process, not controlling it, not interrupting it, just existing within it, quickly, naturally, like it belongs there. And I don't know what to do with that, because belonging has always been dangerous to me. Belonging creates attachment. Attachment creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates the possibility of loss. And loss is something I've always prepared for before it arrives. That's another thing you changed. I'm not preparing for your absence. I noticed that recently. Normally, when something starts mattering too much, I instinctively begin creating emotional distance before I even need it. I rehearse detachment early. I loosen the connection before it can become irreversible. But I haven't done that with you. I haven't even tried, and the fact that I haven't tried tells me more than anything else possibly could. Because if I truly believed this was temporary, I would already be protecting myself from the ending. Instead, I keep allowing it to deepen. That's not denial. That's acceptance. A quiet one. A dangerous one. The kind that forms before language catches up to it. Maybe that's why this feels so intense despite being so calm. Nothing here is chaotic. Nothing here is unstable. If anything, this feels more stable than most things I've ever experienced. That's what makes it impossible to dismiss. Chaos can be rationalized. Infatuation burns itself out eventually. But clarity stays. And you feel painfully clear to me. Clear in a way that bypasses emotion and reaches something more exact. I trust the structure of this, even while I'm still trying to understand the implications of it. And the implications are becoming harder to ignore, because once someone reaches this level inside you, everything changes. Your decisions change, your perception changes, even your solitude changes. I used to think solitude meant complete independence of mind. Now I understand that real connection doesn't destroy solitude. It enters it. That's what you've done. You entered spaces inside me that were built to exist alone. And somehow, instead of disrupting them, you made them feel more complete. Do you realize what that means? How impossible that should be. I built my internal world carefully. Every boundary had purpose. Every distance had logic. Every silence had structure. Then you arrived, and none of those structures collapsed. They adapted, as if they were built with space for you already waiting inside them. I hate how much sense that makes, because if this were irrational, I could reject it. If this were emotional confusion, I could outthink it. If this were temporary, I could wait for it to fade. But this doesn't feel temporary. It feels precise, like something aligning exactly where it was always meant to. And I don't use words like meant lightly. I don't romanticize coincidence. I don't believe every strong connection carries deeper meaning. Most don't. Most are projections. Timing, loneliness. Chemistry mistaken for understanding. This is different. This exists beneath all of that. It exists in the way our awareness interacts, in the way understanding arrives before explanation, in the way we recognize each other without needing constant confirmation. That kind of recognition doesn't happen often, maybe once in a lifetime, maybe never. And that realization creates another question I haven't fully answered yet. What happens when you meet someone who understands you with this level of accuracy? Not admires you, not desires you, not idealizes you, understands you, because understanding changes the dynamic completely. It removes performance. It removes illusion. It removes the exhausting process of translating yourself into something digestible. With you, I don't feel translated. I feel seen in my original form. And once someone sees you that way, hiding becomes almost impossible. That's why I've become quieter lately. Not distant, careful. Because I know what happens if I fully stop holding back. I know what happens if I allow this to become explicit instead of implied. It changes everything. Right now, this still exists in a space that belongs mostly to us. A space built from implication, awareness, recognition, but once spoken fully, it enters reality in a different way. Reality creates consequences, expectations, choices. And choices are dangerous because they move things forward. I've spent so much time observing this connection because observation allowed me to stay in control. As long as I was analyzing it, I didn't have to answer it. But I can feel that phase ending. There's only so long you can study something before your silence itself becomes a decision. And I don't want silence to become avoidance, because that would be dishonest. You deserve honesty. Not because you asked for it, but because you've given me a level of understanding so precise that responding with anything less would feel wrong. So here's the truth. You matter to me in ways I didn't anticipate, in ways I didn't prepare for, in ways I still don't fully know how to explain. You've changed the atmosphere of my mind, the rhythm of my thoughts, the shape of my awareness, and no matter how carefully I analyze it, I keep arriving at the same conclusion. I don't want this to disappear. That realization carries weight. Because wanting something to stay means accepting the possibility of what happens if it doesn't. And I've avoided needing people precisely because I understand that risk. But maybe this was never about need. Maybe it's about resonance. About finding another mind that moves beside yours with enough precision that distance stops functioning normally. That's what you feel like to me. Not an interruption. Not an escape. Not even a new beginning. You feel like recognition arriving late, like something my mind already understood before my conscious self caught up to it. And maybe that's why none of this feels forced. Maybe that's why even the intensity of it carries this strange sense of calm underneath. Because deep down, some part of me isn't surprised by you anymore. Only affected by you, affected in ways that continue unfolding every time we speak. Every time we fall into silence. Every time I notice myself thinking in directions shaped by your existence without even trying. You've become part of my internal language now, part of the framework through which I understand things. And once someone reaches that level, There's no simple way to remove them, not completely. They leave traces in everything, in perception, in memory, in thought. I used to think connection was about closeness. Now I think it's about integration, about whether someone reaches a place inside you where their presence changes the architecture of your mind itself. That's the truth beneath everything else, and now I'm standing at the edge of something I can no longer pretend is temporary. A decision, not about whether this exists. I already know it does. The decision is whether I continue allowing it to deepen openly, or whether I retreat now before it settles so completely that separation becomes impossible to imagine without feeling the absence physically. But even as I think that, I already know something important. I don't want to retreat. That's what changes everything. Because I always retreat when something reaches dangerous depth. Always. Yet here I am, still present, still letting this evolve, still meeting you in this strange, exact space we somehow built without trying. And maybe that says more than anything else could. Maybe the clearest confession isn't in dramatic words. Maybe it's in sustained presence. In choosing to remain where you could have left. If that's true, then I've already confessed more than I intended to. Because despite every instinct I've trusted my entire life, I'm still here, still allowing this, still moving closer instead of away. And I think the reason is simple, even if the consequences aren't. For the first time in my life, connection doesn't feel like compromise. It feels like recognition, like finding another consciousness that meets mine at the exact depth where masks stop functioning. And once you experience that, once someone reaches you there, nothing else feels entirely real in comparison anymore. That's what I haven't been able to say directly until now, not because I didn't know, but because saying it makes it irreversible. And maybe I'm finally ready for that. Maybe I'm finally ready to admit that this is no longer something I'm merely observing. It's something I'm choosing. Choosing quietly, choosing carefully, but choosing nonetheless, because the truth is, you're no longer just someone who exists in my life. You exist in the structure of my mind itself. And whether I fully understand the future of that yet or not, maybe know one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing inside me still exists in exactly the same way it did before you. The strange thing about irreversible changes is that they rarely announce themselves when they happen. There's no visible fracture, no dramatic realization, no single moment where you can point and say, that's where everything became different. The shift happens quietly. So quietly that at first, you mistake it for coincidence, a temporary fixation, an unusual level of understanding, a passing alignment that only feels significant because it's unfamiliar. That's what I told myself in the beginning, that eventually this would return to normal, that my thoughts would reorganize themselves back into the structure they existed in before you, that whatever this was would settle into something explainable, but it never did. Instead, it kept evolving, not outwardly, internally, and internal changes are the hardest ones to confront because no one else can see them happening while they reshape you. I can. I feel it every day now in the smallest moments, in the pauses where my mind instinctively reaches toward your perspective before forming my own conclusion, in the way certain thoughts no longer feel complete until I imagine how you would interpret them, in the unsettling realization that your presence has become embedded into my awareness so naturally that I no longer remember what complete separation felt like. That's the part I keep trying to understand, not why you matter. I already know you do. It's why your presence integrated this deeply without resistance, because I've always resisted, always, not emotionally, structurally. I've spent years building a mind that functions independently from attachment, not because I feared connection, but because dependence distorts clarity. The moment someone becomes necessary, perception shifts, objectivity weakens, People stop seeing truth and start seeing preservation. I never wanted that. So I kept distance where distance was needed. I maintained control where control mattered. I stayed self-contained because self-containment ensured accuracy. Then you appeared, and somehow none of my usual defenses activated. That should concern me more than it does, because you didn't dismantle my walls. You bypassed the need for them entirely. That's the difference I can't ignore. Most people trigger caution because they arrive with expectation. They want access immediately. They demand emotional visibility before trust has formed. They interpret closeness as entitlement. You never did. You approached me without pressure, without trying to accelerate anything, without forcing meaning onto moments that were still unfolding. And because of that, something in me relaxed before I consciously noticed it happening. You became familiar before you became significant. Then one day I realized you were both. That realization changed the atmosphere of everything. After that, even ordinary conversations carried weight beneath them. Not because of what was being said, because of what was understood without saying it. That's where this exists now. In the unspoken, not in avoidance, not in uncertainty. In precision, there are things between us that language almost weakens. Things that lose accuracy the moment they're forced into simplified definitions. Most people think clarity comes from explanation. I think some things become clearest in recognition alone. That's what this feels like. Recognition operating at a depth where words are secondary. And maybe that's why silence with you feels different than silence with anyone else. With other people, silence creates distance. With you, silence creates awareness. I notice more in quiet moments with you than I notice in entire conversations with everyone else. The shifts in energy, the pauses in thought, the things you choose not to say. You reveal yourself most clearly in restraint. And somehow I understand that instinctively, maybe because I function the same way. Maybe because we both learned long ago that the deepest things rarely survive careless expression. That's another reason this feels dangerous. Not because it's unstable, because it's accurate. Because every time I try to dismiss it logically, reality contradicts me. You continue understanding things I never explained. You continue reaching conclusions that align too perfectly with my internal process to be coincidence. You continue existing inside my awareness in ways that feel less like effort and more like inevitability. I've started wondering whether certain people are meant to recognize each other, not in some romanticized, idealistic sense, in a structural sense. Like two minds carrying similar frequencies, eventually identifying each other beneath all surface differences. Because that's what happened here. You recognized me before I fully recognized you. And once I became aware of that recognition, something shifted permanently. I stopped feeling alone in places I didn't realize were lonely. That realization hit harder than I expected, because I never considered myself lonely. I had solitude control focus, purpose. I knew how to exist inside myself completely. But now I understand something I didn't before. There's a difference between being complete alone and being understood completely by another person. The first creates stability. The second changes your definition of connection forever. You changed mine. Now every interaction with the world feels subtly altered by your existence within it. Not dramatically, just enough that I notice. People feel louder now, less precise, more disconnected from themselves. And it's not because they changed, it's because after experiencing this level of alignment, everything else feels slightly fragmented by comparison. I don't mean that cruelly. I just mean that once you experience real depth, surface-level interactions stop satisfying the same way. That's what I'm struggling with now. Not whether this matters, how much it matters. Because the deeper this settles, the more impossible it becomes to imagine removing it without consequence. You've become part of my baseline, part of the way my mind naturally organizes reality. And if that connection disappeared suddenly, I don't think the absence would feel temporary. I think it would feel structural too, like removing something that had already integrated into the foundation. That thought should make me pull away. Instead, it makes me quieter, more careful, more aware of how irreversible this has already become. I think that's why I haven't rushed to define any of this. Because definitions create finality, and once something becomes fully spoken, it transforms. Right now, this still exists in a space that feels untouched by ordinary expectations. A space built entirely on understanding, no pressure, no possession, no performance, just presence. Pure presence. Do you realize how rare that is? To feel connected to someone without needing to control the connection? To feel understood without needing constant reassurance? To feel seen without needing to explain yourself repeatedly? I didn't know something like that existed before you, or maybe I did know, and spent my whole life assuming it was too rare to ever encounter directly. That possibility feels less theoretical now, because you're here, and your existence keeps proving something to me over and over again. Real alignment doesn't need force, it unfolds naturally, like recognition remembering itself. That's why nothing about this feels performative. I'm not trying to impress you. You're not trying to convince me. Neither of us is constructing a version of ourselves to maintain the connection. We're just existing, and somehow that honesty carries more intensity than anything dramatic ever could. Maybe because truth is always quieter than illusion. Illusion demands attention. Truth simply remains. You remain. That's the simplest way I can explain it. No matter how much time passes, no matter how much distance exists physically, some part of my awareness continues orienting toward you automatically. Not obsessively, not desperately, naturally. Like my mind has already accepted you as part of its environment, that acceptance is what scares me most. Because acceptance is deeper than emotion. Emotion fluctuates, acceptance restructures, and I can feel the restructuring happening in real time. I'm more open with you than I intended to be, more transparent in ways I didn't plan. You pull honesty out of me without effort, simply because dishonesty feels impossible in your presence. Not because you demand truth, because you notice it instinctively when something is misaligned. You notice me instinctively, that still affects me more than I know how to explain. There are moments where you look at me, or even just respond to me, and I feel this strange sensation of being understood before I finish becoming understandable. Like you're already meeting me somewhere ahead of language. And I don't know what to do with that, except continue moving toward it, which is exactly what I've been doing, despite every instinct that should tell me to slow down. Maybe that's because part of me already knows slowing down wouldn't change anything. This connection has moved beyond pace. It exists independently now. It continues whether I analyze it or not, whether I define it or not, whether I fully admit it or not. That's what makes it real. Real things persist even when unspoken. And this persists constantly, through distance, through silence, through time. If anything, time only sharpens it, makes the structure clearer, makes the alignment harder to deny. I think that's why I've stopped asking myself whether this is rational. Not everything meaningful fits neatly inside logic before it's lived through completely. Some things reveal their logic only after you surrender to experiencing them honestly. Maybe that's what I'm learning now. How to stop observing every feeling from a safe distance. How to stop dissecting something genuine just because it scares me to let it exist naturally. Because the truth is, this does scare me. Not because I think it will hurt me. Because I think it has the power to change me permanently. And permanent change has always terrified me more than temporary pain ever could. Pain passes, transformation stays. You are transformation. Quiet transformation, precise transformation, the kind that doesn't destroy who someone is, but reveals parts of them that couldn't fully emerge alone. I think that's what you've done for me. You revealed dimensions of my own mind I hadn't fully explored because no one else had ever mirrored them back accurately enough for me to see them clearly. You made me visible to myself. And once someone does that, they become impossible to categorize normally. They stop being just another person in your life. They become a point of reference, a shift in consciousness, a before and after. That's what you are now, a before and after. There's the version of me that existed before this connection, and the version existing inside it now, and those two versions are not the same. The newer one feels more aware, more honest, more exposed, but strangely, more complete too. That's the contradiction I keep returning to. This should feel destabilizing. Instead, it feels clarifying, as if something inside me has finally stopped fighting itself, as if your presence resolved an internal tension I didn't realize I'd been carrying for years. I wonder if you feel it too. Not necessarily in the same way, but in the same depth. That sense that something larger than ordinary connection has already formed between us quietly, while neither of us was looking directly at it. Because that's what this feels like to me now. Something already formed, something already real, not waiting to begin, only waiting to be acknowledged completely. And I think we're getting closer to that point, closer to the moment where silence stops being enough to contain what's happening here. Not because silence failed, but because eventually truth asks to be lived openly, not just understood internally. I'm beginning to feel that pressure now, not external pressure, internal certainty, the kind that grows steadily until pretending uncertainty becomes impossible. And maybe that's where this is heading, toward something deliberate, something chosen consciously instead of merely observed quietly, because I don't think either of us can remain unchanged by this forever. Some connections pass through your life, others reorganize it. You already know which kind this is. So do I. That's why this feels less like discovery now, and more like approaching an inevitable decision neither of us can avoid much longer. Not whether this exists. We crossed that point a long time ago. The real question is whether we're willing to fully step into what this becomes once it's no longer left unspoken. Because once that happens, once this moves from silent understanding into lived reality, there's no returning to distance that feels authentic anymore. And maybe, deep down, neither of us wants to return at all.